My social climber best friend kept borrowing my designer items while telling everyone that I am a charity case. She was humiliated spectacularly in her last attempt to copy me. How did the fake rich girl finally get caught in her own web? There was this girl Bella in my economics class who came from a regular middle-class family, but desperately wanted everyone to think she was wealthy. She figured out early on that I had money but kept a low profile about it, and she saw me as her perfect target. It started small with Bella asking to borrow my designer sunglasses for one day. The next morning she wore them to school, and when people complimented them she said, "Thanks, I let Amy borrow them yesterday, but I needed them back," making it sound like they were hers and I was the one always borrowing from her. She did this with everything. She'd ask to borrow my laptop for one class because hers was updating, then tell everyone in that class, "Amy's laptop crashed again, so I'm letting her use mine later." She'd literally be typing on my MacBook while telling people I was the one who needed to borrow hers. The pattern escalated fast. Bella would come to my house to study and take photos of herself in my room, then post them implying it was her bedroom. When classmates came over to her actual house, she'd say she preferred hosting at her other property, meaning my family's place. She got bolder with bigger items, asked to borrow my Canada Goose jacket because she was cold, then wore it for a week straight, telling everyone she was letting me wear her old one while she broke in her new jacket. I was literally wearing my own jacket while she told people it was her hand-me-down. The most infuriating part was how she'd flip every single situation. She'd ask me for rides to school in my car, then tell everyone she was carpooling with me to help save the environment and letting me use her parking pass. Other students started thinking I was this leech who was always borrowing Bella's stuff. She built this entire persona around being generous to her poor friend Amy. Teachers thought she was so kind for always helping me out. She'd even do this fake concerned voice saying things like, "Amy's having a tough time financially, but I don't mind sharing what I have." Nobody realized she was describing her own situation while using my actual belongings. This went on for 2 full years. 2 years of her wearing my clothes while telling people she was lending me hers. 2 years of her using my electronics and claiming she was letting me borrow them. 2 years of her taking credit for things I owned while making me look like a charity case. I never said anything because honestly I didn't care what people thought and found it pathetically amusing how desperate she was. But then Bella made a massive mistake. She started dating this guy Oliver who was genuinely rich, and she felt pressure to prove she belonged in his world. She invited his whole friend group to what she called her family's ski cabin for winter break. She'd been posting photos from my family's cabin for months, pretending it was hers, so she was confident she could pull this off. She told everyone to meet there directly and gave them the address. What Bella didn't know was that my parents had decided to spend winter break at the cabin for the first time in years. Oliver and his friends were standing at the door when my mother answered, completely confused. They explained they were there for Bella's family ski weekend and showed the text with the address. My mother called me immediately while these rich kids stood in the doorway with their Louis Vuitton luggage. I explained everything to my mom about Bella's 2-year con game. My mother, who is usually very reserved, was absolutely furious that someone had been exploiting our family's generosity and giving out our address to strangers. She handled it perfectly. She invited all of them inside and served them hot chocolate while they waited for Bella to arrive. Bella showed up an hour later in an Uber wearing my Burberry scarf that she'd borrowed the week before. She walked in to find Oliver, his friends, my parents, and me sitting in the living room. My mother said, "Bella, I'm so confused. These lovely people say this is your family cabin, but this is our house. And isn't that Amy's scarf you're wearing?" The room went completely silent as Bella tried to stammer out an explanation. Oliver slowly started piecing together every story Bella had told him. The designer bags she owned that I was always borrowing were actually mine. The car she let me use was mine. The vacation photos from Europe were from my family trips. My mother continued, "Should we call your parents to come get you? I have your mother's number from school." Bella went completely white. Bella stood frozen in my family's cabin living room wearing my Burberry scarf, while Oliver stared at her with dawning horror, and his friends shifted uncomfortably on the leather couches. My mother's question hung in the air, and I watched Bella's face cycle through panic, calculation, and desperate searching for an exit that didn't exist. Her hands trembled as she touched the scarf around her neck, and her mouth opened twice without any sound coming out. Oliver's friend Alexandra leaned forward on the couch, her expensive boots making a soft scraping sound against the hardwood floor. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, the same fireplace that appeared in dozens of Bella's social media posts with captions about family traditions and cozy winter evenings. My father stood near the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, his face showing the kind of quiet anger that meant he was holding back from saying something harsh. Bella's eyes darted between all of us, landing finally on me, and I saw something like betrayal flash across her face, as if I had somehow wronged her by existing in my own family's cabin. Oliver spoke first, his voice quiet and controlled in a way that sounded more dangerous than yelling. He asked Bella to explain why she told him this was her family's cabin, why she gave him this address, why she was wearing what she just claimed yesterday was a scarf she'd owned for years. His words came out measured and precise, each question landing like a separate accusation. Bella's face flushed red, then drained white again. She wrapped her arms around herself, the scarf slipping slightly down her shoulder. Oliver's other friend Justin shifted his weight on the couch, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding in front of him. My mother remained standing near the entryway, her posture perfect, her expression neutral except for the slight tightness around her eyes. Oliver continued staring at Bella, waiting for an answer that she couldn't seem to form. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. I could hear the wind outside picking up, rattling the windows slightly. Bella tried to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, saying she never actually claimed the cabin was hers, just that she had access to it through her close friendship with my family. Her voice came out higher than normal, almost shrill. She said something about how she thought it would be fun to surprise everyone by bringing them to this beautiful place, that she was doing Oliver a favor by organizing this weekend trip. My mother's eyebrows rose in a way I recognized from childhood as her most lethal expression of polite disbelief. Bella kept talking faster, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to construct some version of events that made sense. She gestured at me, saying we were such close friends that we basically shared everything, that the boundaries between our belongings were blurry by design. She said my family had always told her to make herself at home here, to treat the cabin like her own space. My father made a small sound of disagreement from the kitchen doorway. Bella's hands fluttered near her throat, touching the scarf again. Oliver's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. Alexandra spoke up from the couch, pulling out her phone to show photos Bella posted on social media over the past 6 months with captions like my favorite place and family traditions, featuring my cabin's distinctive stone fireplace. She scrolled through post after post, each one showing Bella posing in different areas of the cabin with captions that clearly implied ownership. The evidence was digital and undeniable, and Bella's face drained of color. Alexandra held up the phone so Oliver could see, and he leaned in to look at the screen. Justin looked over too, his expression shifting from uncomfortable to something closer to anger. One photo showed Bella sitting in my father's favorite armchair with a book, captioned Sunday reading in the family cabin. Another showed her on the deck outside with a mug, captioned morning coffee at home. Alexandra kept scrolling, and there were at least 20 posts, all carefully crafted to suggest this was Bella's family property. My mother moved closer to look at the phone, and her mouth formed a thin line. Bella started to say something about how those captions were just casual social media language that everyone exaggerates online. Alexandra put her phone down and crossed her arms. I finally broke my silence to tell Oliver and his friends the full story, starting with the sunglasses 2 years ago and walking through every incident of Bella borrowing my belongings, then claiming I borrowed from her. My voice stayed steady and almost clinical as I described the systematic pattern. I explained about the laptop, how she'd use it in class while telling everyone it was hers, and she was letting me borrow it. I talked about the Canada Goose jacket, how she wore it for a week while claiming she was lending me her old one. I described how she'd take photos in my bedroom and post them implying it was her space. I explained the car situation, how she'd ask for rides, then tell everyone she was carpooling with me to help the environment. Oliver's expression shifted from confusion to sick recognition as I laid out the pattern. His hands gripped the arms of the chair he was sitting in. Alexandra's eyes widened with each new example. Justin shook his head slowly. My mother listened without interrupting, her face growing more set with each detail. I kept my voice level, not emotional, just presenting the facts like I was describing a case study in our economics class. Oliver interrupted to say that Bella told him I was struggling financially, that she was helping me out by sharing her things and giving me rides because my family hit hard times. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Alexandra and the other friends nodded, confirming Bella told them all the same story about her generous support of her less fortunate friend. Justin said Bella had mentioned several times how she was trying to help me without making me feel bad about accepting charity. Alexandra added that Bella often talked about how important it was to support friends going through tough situations. Oliver's face showed a mixture of hurt and anger as he realized the depth of the deception. He'd believed every word, had probably admired Bella for what he thought was her kindness and generosity. The whole friend group had bought into this narrative of Bella as the wealthy, compassionate friend helping poor Amy. My father made another sound from the doorway, this one clearly expressing disgust. Bella stood there taking it all in, her face cycling through different emotions too quickly to track. My mother's fury became visible as she stood and asked Bella directly how she dares to exploit her daughter's kindness and give out their private address to strangers. Her voice never rose above conversational volume, but the cold anger made Bella step backward toward the door. My mother's words were precise and cutting, asking if Bella understood the security risk of giving out someone else's private property location to people her family had never met. She asked how Bella justified using our home, our belongings, our family's privacy, as props for her social performance. My father moved from the doorway to stand beside my mother, presenting a united front. Bella's back hit the door and she seemed to realize she'd run out of room to retreat. My mother continued, saying she'd welcomed Bella into our home multiple times for study sessions, had treated her with courtesy and hospitality, and this was how Bella repaid that trust. The disappointment in my mother's voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. Oliver and his friends sat frozen on the couches, clearly not knowing whether to leave or stay. Bella's eyes filled with tears. Bella broke down crying and tried to apologize, saying she never meant for it to go this far, that it started small and she couldn't figure out how to stop the lie from growing. The tears looked genuine, streaming down her face as her shoulders shook. She said she was just trying to fit in, that she felt so much pressure to prove she belonged in Oliver's world. She admitted she made terrible choices and that she was so sorry, that she never wanted to hurt anyone. Her voice broke on the words and she covered her face with her hands. The Burberry scarf hung loose around her neck now, one end trailing down. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she knew it was wrong, that she'd gotten caught up in the lie and didn't know how to come clean without losing everything. I watched her cry and felt nothing except a strange emptiness where I expected satisfaction to be. Part of me had imagined this moment during the 2 years of her deception, but now that it was happening, I just felt tired and slightly sad. My mother's expression softened slightly, but she didn't move to comfort Bella. Oliver stared at his hands. Oliver told Bella he needed her to leave immediately, his voice flat and final. He said one of his friends would drive her back to campus, but he was staying here because he needed time to process how completely she lied to him about every aspect of her life. His words were quiet but absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or discussion. Bella looked at him with desperate hope, starting to say something about how they could talk through this, how she could explain everything properly. Oliver held up his hand to stop her, shaking his head. He said he couldn't even look at her right now, that every conversation they'd ever had was now suspect in his mind. He needed space and time to figure out what was real and what was performance. Alexandra and Justin exchanged glances, clearly understanding that the relationship was over. Bella's crying intensified, but Oliver's expression didn't change. My mother moved to open the door behind Bella, the gesture both courteous and unmistakably final. Justin volunteered to drive Bella back, clearly wanting to escape the awful tension in the room. He stood up quickly, grabbing his jacket from the coat rack near the door. Bella grabbed her bag with shaking hands and turned toward the exit. The Burberry scarf slipped off her shoulders onto my mother's antique rug as she rushed out the door, leaving it behind like evidence of everything that had just collapsed. Justin followed her out, not making eye contact with anyone. We heard car doors slam and an engine start, then the sound of tires on the gravel driveway fading into the distance. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Oliver sat motionless on the couch, staring at nothing. Alexandra looked between my parents and me, clearly uncertain what to say or do next. My father closed the door quietly and picked up the scarf from the floor, holding it for a moment before handing it to my mother. She folded it carefully and set it on the entry table. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed. My mother moved toward the kitchen and returned with the hot chocolate pot, refilling Oliver's mug and then Alexandra's without asking if they wanted more. She set the pot down on a coaster and suggested they stay for the weekend since they'd driven all this way, and the cabin had plenty of space. Her voice had returned to its normal gracious tone, the fury from earlier completely smoothed away now that the immediate threat had left. Oliver looked surprised by the offer and glanced at me before responding. He thanked my mother and said he appreciated the kindness but didn't want to impose after everything that just happened. My mother waved away his concern and said it was no imposition at all, that she felt terrible they'd been deceived and dragged into such an uncomfortable situation. Alexandra accepted immediately, saying the drive back would take hours, and she'd been looking forward to skiing all week. Oliver hesitated another moment, then agreed, thanking my parents again for their understanding. I felt grateful for my mother's social grace in that moment, how she could compartmentalize her anger at the situation and still extend genuine hospitality to people who'd done nothing wrong. Oliver set his mug down and looked directly at my father, apologizing for the intrusion and thanking them both for exposing what was happening before he got more seriously involved with Bella. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking slightly. He admitted he'd been considering introducing Bella to his family over spring break, that his parents were already asking questions about his new relationship. The thought of what could have happened made him go quiet for a moment, staring at the fire. He said his family had dealt with people trying to use them for money and connections before, that his parents had warned him to be careful about who he trusted. My mother reached over and squeezed his shoulder briefly, saying he couldn't have known because Bella had been very calculated in building her false narrative. My father nodded and said the important thing was, the truth came out before any real damage was done to Oliver's family relationships. Alexandra stood up and caught my eye, gesturing toward the hallway. My mother was already moving toward the guest rooms, telling Oliver to follow her so she could show him where he'd be staying. Alexandra pulled me aside once they'd left the living room and asked quietly if I was okay. Her face looked genuinely concerned, not the fake sympathy I'd seen from people who thought I was struggling financially. She said she felt terrible for believing Bella's stories and treating me with the kind of patronizing sympathy people reserve for others facing hardship. She admitted she'd recommended Bella for a scholarship committee position in their sorority, because she thought Bella understood what it was like to help friends through tough times. The remorse in her voice surprised me because most people who got fooled by Bella just seemed embarrassed about being tricked. I told Alexandra I mostly found the whole thing amusing until it invaded my private family space, that I never cared much what people thought about my financial situation. She looked at me with confusion and said that my tolerance for being misrepresented seemed unhealthy, that letting someone build an entire false narrative about me for 2 years wasn't something to be proud of. Her observation hit harder than I expected because it was accurate in a way I'd been avoiding. I'd told myself I was above caring, that my detachment proved I was more mature than people who worried about reputation. But Alexandra was right that my pride in being above it all might have been its own form of problem. I'd enabled Bella's behavior by refusing to correct anyone, and that silence had consequences for other people beyond just me. Later that evening, a car pulled into the driveway and my father came through the door carrying his briefcase and overnight bag. My mother had called him at work after the confrontation, and he'd driven straight to the cabin. He dropped his bags by the door and asked where everyone was. his jaw tight in a way that meant he was angry. My mother explained that Oliver and Alexandra were staying in the guest rooms, and that Bella had already left. My father's expression didn't soften. He said he wanted to know if we should pursue legal action or report Bella to the university for fraud, that giving out our address to strangers and impersonating ownership of our property could have serious consequences. His anger was less controlled than my mother's, more raw and protective. He kept saying someone needed to be held accountable for exploiting our family's generosity this way. I told my father I didn't want to escalate this into a legal situation, that the social consequences would be harsh enough once word spread about what happened at the cabin. The exposure itself was punishment, and taking it further felt like overkill for someone who was clearly struggling with serious insecurity issues. My mother agreed with me, but insisted we needed to set clear boundaries about Bella never contacting our family again. She said she'd already decided to inform the university's housing office about the situation, so they'd be aware if any similar issues came up. My father looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded, saying he'd respect our decision, but Bella better stay far away from all of us going forward. Oliver joined us for dinner in the cabin's dining room, and the conversation stayed carefully away from Bella for the first part of the meal. But eventually, Oliver started sharing more details about his relationship with her, how she'd seemed so confident and knowledgeable about things he cared about. He mentioned expensive restaurants where she always ordered without hesitation, and talked about her family's investment portfolio and real estate holdings. He realized now she was probably taking stories I'd told her about my family and presenting them as her own background. Every conversation they'd had about travel or culture or business was suspect now, because he couldn't tell what was real and what was borrowed from my life. My father asked how long they'd been dating, and Oliver said 3 months, which felt both very short and somehow too long, given how deep the deception went. The next morning, Alexandra found me in the kitchen making coffee and asked if we could talk privately. We walked down the slope behind the cabin to the lake, our boots crunching through patches of old snow. The air was cold and sharp, and our breath made clouds as we walked. Alexandra explained that she was in a sorority with several girls who knew both Bella and me. That news about what happened would spread quickly once people started asking questions about why Bella wasn't at the cabin weekend she'd been planning for weeks. She wanted my permission before saying anything about what happened, because she didn't want to make the situation worse for me. I appreciated her asking, but knew the story would come out regardless of what I said. I told Alexandra she could share the truth with whoever asked, but I didn't want this to become some kind of revenge campaign or public humiliation beyond the natural consequences of Bella's actions being exposed. Alexandra nodded and said she respected that approach, but people deserved to know they'd been manipulated into believing a false narrative about both of us. She said at least 5 girls in her sorority had donated money or items to campus fundraisers that Bella claimed were to help students like me who were struggling financially. The thought of Bella using fake stories about my supposed hardship to get sympathy donations made my stomach turn. Alexandra promised she'd tell people the truth without turning it into gossip or drama, that she'd focus on correcting the record rather than destroying Bella's reputation further. When I returned to campus on Monday, the changes were immediate and obvious. People looked at me differently in the hallways, not with the fake sympathy I'd gotten used to, but with curiosity and something like respect. Portia stopped me right before economics class started, pulling me aside near the doorway. She apologized for treating me like a charity case, saying Alexandra had explained what really happened at the cabin over the weekend. Portia's face was red, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes as she talked. She said she'd felt good about herself for being nice to someone she thought was struggling, and now she felt like an idiot for believing Bella's stories without ever asking me directly. I told her it was okay, that Bella had been very convincing and I'd never corrected anyone, so there was no way for people to know the truth. Portia looked relieved but still embarrassed as she headed to her seat. The economics professor caught me as I packed up my laptop after class, her hand touching my shoulder in that way teachers do when they need a private word. She pulled me aside near the empty back row and said she'd heard about what happened with Bella over winter break. Her face looked pained and uncomfortable as she explained that last semester she'd praised Bella in front of the whole class for being so generous to me during what she thought were my financial difficulties. She said she felt terrible for contributing to a false narrative that made me look like a charity case when the truth was completely opposite. I told her she had no way of knowing what was really going on, that Bella was very convincing and had fooled everyone for 2 years. The professor nodded but still looked guilty as she gathered her papers and left the classroom. I noticed Bella's empty seat the next few classes, and initially assumed she was just avoiding me. By Thursday, I realized she hadn't shown up to economics all week. The RA stopped me in the hallway outside my dorm room on Friday afternoon and mentioned that Bella had requested an emergency room transfer to a different building across campus. She'd moved out over the weekend while most students were still on break. The RA seemed curious about why Bella left so suddenly, but didn't ask directly. I just nodded and said we'd had a falling out. The speed of Bella's complete retreat surprised me, even though it made sense. She couldn't face the people who'd watched her perform the generous benefactor act for 2 solid years. Every hallway and classroom held witnesses to her lies, and she'd chosen to run rather than endure their stares and whispered conversations. Michaela found me in the campus coffee shop on Tuesday morning while I was waiting for my latte. She slid into the chair across from me without asking, and immediately launched into an apology. She said she'd been spreading stories about my supposed money troubles to other students, talking about how Bella was such a good friend for helping me through hard times. Her voice got quieter as she admitted she'd felt superior being friends with someone wealthy enough to support a struggling classmate. She said recognizing her own part in the deception made her deeply uncomfortable because she'd enjoyed feeling charitable by association. I stirred sugar into my coffee and told her I understood, that Bella had manipulated everyone's good intentions. Michaela looked relieved but still couldn't quite meet my eyes as she grabbed her drink and headed to class. The staring started that same week and got worse as more people heard the full story. Students I barely recognized would lock eyes with me in the library or dining hall, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity to something like embarrassment. They were clearly reassessing everything they thought they knew about the quiet girl who wore plain jeans and drove a basic sedan to campus. I caught groups of students whispering and glancing my way during lunch breaks. Someone had apparently shared photos from my social media showing my family's actual house and the European vacations Bella had claimed as her own. The attention felt invasive and strange in a way Bella's lies never had. At least when people thought I was poor, they mostly ignored me. Now I felt examined and discussed like some kind of fascinating specimen. I started eating lunch in my car just to avoid the cafeteria scrutiny. My phone buzzed with a text from Oliver on Wednesday evening, asking if we could meet for coffee. He said he needed to understand how I let Bella's deception continue for 2 full years without correcting anyone. His message didn't sound angry or accusatory, just genuinely confused about my choices. I stared at the text for several minutes before responding that I owed him an honest explanation. We agreed to meet at the coffee shop near campus on Thursday afternoon. I spent the next day trying to figure out how to explain my pride and detachment to someone who'd been directly hurt by my silence. The truth was, I didn't have a good answer that would make sense to anyone outside my own head. Oliver was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee waiting. He looked tired, and his usual confident posture seemed diminished somehow. I sat down and tried to explain that my pride made me feel above caring what people thought, that I found Bella's desperate social climbing more pathetic than threatening. I told him I knew it sounded arrogant, but I genuinely didn't care if classmates believed I was poor, because their opinions felt meaningless to me. Oliver listened without interrupting, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before suggesting my detachment might have enabled Bella's escalation. He said my refusal to correct the narrative gave Bella permission to keep building bigger lies because she faced no consequences. The observation hit harder than I expected because I hadn't fully considered my own role in letting things spiral out of control. Oliver pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of texts from Bella. She'd been messaging him constantly since the cabin disaster, sending long paragraphs about her insecurity and family pressure to appear successful. Some of the messages revealed genuine psychological struggles about never feeling good enough and desperately wanting to fit in with people who had more money. He scrolled through dozens of texts, each one more desperate than the last. Oliver said he felt sympathy for her obvious pain, but couldn't separate compassion for her situation from anger about her deliberate choice to lie to him for 3 months. He said some people face insecurity without systematically deceiving everyone around them. I read a few of the messages and recognized real distress in Bella's words, but it was hard to feel sorry for her when she'd spent 2 years making me look like a leech to our entire social circle. I asked Oliver what he planned to do about Bella's constant messages. He set his phone down and said he was blocking her number that evening because he couldn't trust anything she said anymore. Every story she'd told him about her life was potentially borrowed from mine or completely fabricated. He didn't know if her family was actually pressuring her, or if that was another lie to gain sympathy. Oliver admitted he felt guilty about cutting her off when she was clearly struggling with serious issues, but he needed to protect himself from further manipulation. He said he couldn't be her therapist or her savior, that she needed professional help he wasn't qualified to provide. I understood his decision completely and told him so. Some situations require clean breaks even when they feel harsh. My mother called Friday evening while I was studying in my room. She asked how I was handling everything and whether students on campus were treating me differently. I told her about the staring and the awkward apologies from people who'd believed Bella's stories. My mother then mentioned that Bella's mother had contacted her earlier that week, asking for compassion and understanding for her daughter's mistakes. She said Bella's mother claimed her daughter was having a breakdown and needed forgiveness from our family to start healing. My mother's voice was firm as she told me she'd declined to engage beyond saying our family needed distance from the situation. She said she felt bad for Bella's mother, but couldn't offer absolution when Bella had exploited our generosity and given strangers our private address. I felt relieved my mother was maintaining clear boundaries instead of letting guilt push her toward premature forgiveness. The campus counselor sent an email on Monday morning with the subject line offering support services. The message was carefully worded and professional, suggesting I might benefit from processing recent events with a trained counselor. I deleted the email initially because the idea of therapy felt unnecessary and dramatic. But over the next few days, the unwanted attention continued, and my feelings about the whole situation got more complicated and confusing. I'd catch myself getting angry at Bella, then immediately feeling guilty for being angry at someone who was clearly mentally unwell. By Thursday, I'd reopened the counselor's email and clicked the scheduling link. The first available appointment was the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I booked it before I could change my mind again. The campus counseling office was in the basement of the Student Services building, and the beige walls and motivational posters made it feel like a dentist's waiting room. I sat in the chair across from the counselor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, and tried to explain why I was there. I told her about Bella's 2 years of lies, about the cabin incident, about how everyone now treated me differently. Then I admitted the part that confused me most, that I felt guilty even though I was the one who got used. The counselor leaned forward and asked me to describe what I felt guilty about specifically. I struggled to find the right words, saying something about how Bella looked when my mother exposed her, how broken she seemed standing there in my scarf. The counselor nodded slowly and suggested that my guilt came from watching another person get publicly destroyed, even when that person deserved consequences for what they did. She said recognizing the human cost of exposure doesn't make me responsible for Bella's choices, but it does show I have empathy. That made sense, but didn't make the guilty feeling go away. The counselor then asked why I never corrected anyone during the 2 years Bella was lying. I tried to explain that it felt silly to defend my financial status, that I didn't want to be the person who bragged about having money. The words came out wrong and defensive, and I could hear how weak the explanation sounded. She waited for me to finish, then gently pointed out that my pride in staying quiet actually helped Bella's scheme work. She said other people believed the false story I let continue, and some of those people probably treated me badly because they thought I was taking advantage of Bella's generosity. My silence didn't just affect me, it affected everyone who got fooled. I sat there feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, because she was right. I'd been so focused on being above it all that I never considered the damage the lies caused to other people. 3 weeks later, I was in the library looking for a book about market economics when I saw Bella 2 rows over. She looked terrible, with dark shadows under her eyes and her hair pulled back messily. She was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, nothing like her usual carefully put-together appearance. Our eyes met for half a second before she quickly looked away and started walking toward the exit. I watched her hurry past the study tables with her head down, and something made me follow her. I caught up near the stairs and said her name. She stopped but didn't turn around right away, and when she finally looked at me, her expression was pure fear. I asked if we could talk for a minute. She nodded without speaking, and we found an empty study room on the second floor. As soon as the door closed, Bella started apologizing in a rush of words that tumbled over each other. She said she was sorry, that she knew what she did was horrible, that she understood if I hated her forever. The apology sounded practiced, like she'd been rehearsing it in her head for weeks, but the desperation behind it seemed real. Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking at the floor instead of at me. I let her finish talking before I said anything. Then I asked her why she did it, why she spent 2 years making me look like a charity case to everyone we knew. Bella took a shaky breath and started explaining about her parents. She said they put constant pressure on her to network with wealthy students, to make connections that could help her career after graduation. Her dad kept telling her that success was about who you know, and her mom compared her to cousins who married rich guys or got jobs through family connections. She said it started with just making her background sound better than it was, exaggerating a little to fit in with Oliver's crowd. Then she realized how easily people believed her stories about helping me, and it spiraled from there. I listened to her explanation and felt a mix of understanding and anger. I told Bella that knowing her motivation didn't excuse 2 years of lying about me to everyone. I said she made me look like someone who borrowed things and never gave them back, someone who needed financial help from a friend. She nodded and said she knew, that nothing excused what she did. Then she mentioned she started seeing a therapist twice a week to figure out why she felt so desperate to pretend to be someone else. She said the therapist was helping her understand that her self-worth got tied up in what other people thought about her status. I could see she was genuinely trying to work on herself, but that didn't erase the damage she caused. Bella looked at me with red eyes and asked if there was any way I could tell people she wasn't a completely terrible person. She said the situation was more complicated than just wanting to hurt me, that she got trapped in lies she didn't know how to escape. I thought about it for a moment before telling her honestly that I couldn't help fix her reputation. I said I was still dealing with my own complicated feelings about everything that happened, about my role in letting it continue for so long. I told her I needed to process my own stuff before I could think about helping her with hers. She nodded and said she understood, that it was fair. Then she picked up her backpack and left the study room without looking back. After Bella walked out, I stayed in the study room staring at the whiteboard on the wall. I felt completely drained, like the conversation had used up all my energy. The counselor's words kept playing in my head about how my detachment and pride let the situation grow. I realized that by staying quiet and acting like I was above caring, I actually caused real damage. People believed lies about me because I never bothered to correct them. Teachers and students thought I was struggling when I wasn't. Bella's fake narrative filled a space I created by hiding who I really was. The recognition hit me hard, that I wasn't just a victim in this situation. My choices enabled what happened even if I didn't mean for them to. My phone buzzed with a text from Oliver asking if I was okay. He said he heard through Alexandra that I talked to Bella in the library. I appreciated that he was checking on me, but I realized I needed to handle this situation on my own instead of leaning on his support. He was dealing with his own feelings about being lied to for 3 months, about thinking he was dating someone who turned out to be completely different. I texted back that I was fine and would talk to him later. Then I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet study room trying to sort through everything I was feeling. The following weekend, my parents drove up to campus and took me to dinner at an expensive Italian restaurant downtown. I usually avoided places like this because I didn't like drawing attention to my family's money, but my mother insisted. We sat at a table near the window and ordered pasta while my parents asked how I was handling everything. I told them about the stairs on campus, about people apologizing for believing Bella's stories, about the conversation in the library. My mother listened carefully while cutting her chicken. Then she said something that surprised me. She suggested that hiding my background so completely might have actually helped create the situation. She said when you leave an information gap, other people will fill it with whatever story makes sense to them. Bella just happened to fill that gap with lies that served her purposes. I pushed back at the suggestion that I needed to announce my family's money to everyone. I told my mother that hiding my background wasn't the problem, and I shouldn't have to advertise my financial status just because someone decided to lie about me. She started to respond, but my father held up his hand and said both things could be true at the same time. He explained that I had every right to keep my private life private, but my extreme secrecy about everything created a vacuum where someone like Bella could plant false stories. He said when you refuse to share anything real about yourself, people fill in the blanks with whatever narrative seems to fit, and Bella just happened to fill those blanks with lies that served her purposes. I sat there cutting my pasta into smaller and smaller pieces while my parents waited for me to respond. Finally, I admitted they might have a point, but I still felt angry that the responsibility was somehow landing on me to fix a situation I didn't create. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand before saying she understood my frustration. But moving forward, I needed to find a balance between privacy and being authentic about who I am. During dessert, my mother mentioned that several parents from Oliver's friend group had been reaching out to thank her for exposing what was happening before their kids got more involved with Bella. She said one mother sent flowers and a card expressing relief that the truth came out when it did. Then my mother dropped a bomb by saying Alexandra's mother specifically mentioned being grateful everything was revealed before Oliver proposed to Bella. I nearly choked on my tiramisu and asked what she meant by proposed, since I thought they'd only been dating for 3 months. My mother looked surprised that I didn't know and explained that Oliver had apparently been looking at engagement rings and talking to his parents about Bella being the one. She said Alexandra's mother was horrified when she found out how close her son's friend came to getting engaged to someone living a completely fabricated life. The information sat heavy in my stomach as I realized how much deeper Bella's deception went than I'd understood. Oliver wasn't just some casual boyfriend she lied to for a few months. She'd convinced him she was marriage material, and he'd been planning a future with someone who didn't actually exist. Back in my dorm that evening, I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything my parents said. The more I reflected on the past 2 years, the more I recognized an uncomfortable truth about my own behavior. My determination to stay low profile about money wasn't just about privacy or avoiding attention. It was actually a form of looking down on other people while pretending I was above all that. I'd judged students who drove nice cars or wore obvious designer clothes as showing off and tacky. I'd felt secretly superior because I had the restraint and class to hide my wealth while they flaunted theirs. That pride and sense of being better than everyone else had blinded me to the real damage my silence was causing. Teachers thought I was struggling and probably gave me extra patience or lowered expectations. Students who actually did come from difficult financial situations might have felt uncomfortable around me thinking we shared the same challenges when we absolutely didn't. Bella filled the information gap I created, but I'm the one who created that gap in the first place by acting like my background was some shameful secret that needed hiding. The next week in economics class, a new student approached my desk before the professor arrived. She introduced herself and asked if I could recommend good study resources since she'd heard from other students that I was strong in the subject. The interaction was so simple and normal that I almost didn't know how to respond after weeks of loaded conversations and apologetic stares. I told her about the textbook companion website and a YouTube channel that explained concepts clearly, and she thanked me before heading to her seat. Something about that brief exchange felt refreshing and clean, like maybe eventually people would stop seeing me through the lens of the Bella situation and just see me as a regular student again. The professor started class and I found myself actually paying attention, instead of letting my mind wander like I usually did. After class, Portia caught up with me in the hallway and asked if I wanted to join a study group she was putting together for the upcoming midterm. She said Michaela would be there plus 2 other students I barely knew, and they were meeting Thursday evening in the library. I almost said no out of habit since I'd always preferred studying alone, but something made me agree instead. Thursday evening, I showed up at the library study room and found the group already spread out with textbooks and laptops covering the table. The evening turned out surprisingly pleasant with everyone focused on actually studying, instead of dancing around the Bella situation. We worked through practice problems and explained concepts to each other, and nobody made awkward references or gave me pitying looks. One of the students I didn't know well made a joke about the professor's terrible handwriting, and everyone laughed, and I realized this was the first time in weeks I'd felt like just another person in a group, instead of the girl at the center of some drama. After study group ended, Michaela walked back toward the dorms with me since we lived in the same building. We chatted about the upcoming midterm and complained about the reading load. Then she mentioned something that made me stop walking. She said Bella had withdrawn from the school for the semester to focus on mental health treatment. I asked how she knew, and Michaela explained that Bella's roommate told people Bella's parents pulled her out and enrolled her in an intensive therapy program. Michaela said student opinions were split pretty evenly, with some people thinking Bella got off easy by leaving instead of facing everyone, while others felt genuinely sorry for her and thought the public humiliation was punishment enough. She said the divided reactions showed how complicated the whole situation really was, since Bella clearly had serious issues, but she'd also deliberately hurt people with her lies. I admitted to Michaela that I felt guilty about Bella withdrawing, even though logically I knew I didn't cause her breakdown. Michaela stopped walking and turned to look at me directly, before saying that feeling guilty was normal, and actually showed I was a decent person. She explained that having sympathy for someone who hurt you doesn't mean you're responsible for the consequences they face from their own actions. Her straightforward perspective cut through all the complicated feelings I'd been struggling with and made things feel clearer. She said Bella made choices every single day for 2 years to keep lying and escalating her deception, and eventually those choices caught up with her in a way that felt devastating, but was ultimately her own doing. We reached the dorm entrance, and Michaela gave me a quick hug before heading to her floor, and I felt lighter than I had in days. The next afternoon, Oliver stopped by my dorm to return a book I'd lent him during the ski weekend. I invited him in, and we ended up sitting on my floor talking for almost 2 hours about trust and lies, and how to move forward after someone betrays you completely. Oliver said he'd decided to take a break from dating because he needed to work on his judgment about people and figure out how he missed so many red flags with Bella. He described moments during their relationship where things didn't quite add up, but he'd explained them away or given her the benefit of the doubt. I shared similar moments from my friendship with Bella, where her stories didn't match reality, but I'd been too detached and amused by her desperation to actually call her out. Oliver said maybe we both learned something about the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels off instead of making excuses for people's sketchy behavior. I told Oliver that counseling had been helping me recognize how my pride and emotional distance were actually ways of protecting myself from being vulnerable with people. He nodded and said he could relate because his family's wealth made him develop similar strategies for keeping people at arm's length. We talked about the unexpected downsides of financial privilege and how it can make you either overly suspicious of everyone's motives or completely blind to manipulation because you assume people are being genuine. Oliver said one positive thing that came from the whole mess was realizing he wanted friendships based on actual connection instead of surface-level interactions, and I agreed that maybe getting forced out of my detached observer role wasn't entirely bad, even though it felt uncomfortable. Spring semester started with me taking a lighter course load so I could focus more on each class, instead of just going through the motions. I made a conscious decision to participate more in discussions and engage with the material, instead of sitting in the back row mentally checked out like I'd done for years. Several professors commented on the change and said they were glad to see me contributing since I clearly understood the concepts. The engagement felt healthier than my old approach of staying invisible and above it all. One professor asked me to stay after class and said she was impressed by my recent participation, then asked if I'd be interested in being a teaching assistant next semester. I said yes without overthinking it, recognizing the opportunity as a chance to step into a more visible role without apologizing for it or hiding behind false humility. The next week, Alexandra texted asking if I wanted to come to a sorority event at her chapter house as her guest. My stomach tightened reading the invitation because I knew everyone there would have heard about the Bella situation through campus gossip. I considered making an excuse but realized that hiding would just confirm I was ashamed or embarrassed about something that wasn't my fault. I texted back yes and spent the next 3 days feeling nervous about walking into a room full of people who knew my private family business. The night of the event, I changed outfits 4 times before settling on jeans and a simple sweater that felt neither too casual nor like I was trying too hard. Alexandra met me at the door of the sorority house and squeezed my arm in a way that felt reassuring without being obvious. The main room was packed with maybe 50 girls talking in clusters, and I braced myself for stares or whispers. But most people just smiled normally when Alexandra introduced me around, and several girls struck up regular conversations about classes and weekend plans without any awkward references to drama. A junior named Rachel approached me near the snack table and said quietly that she was sorry for assuming things about my situation based on what Bella had said. Her apology was brief and sincere without being dramatic, and I thanked her for saying something. 2 other girls offered similar quick apologies throughout the evening, acknowledging they'd believed a false narrative without making it into a big production. By the time I left 3 hours later, I felt lighter, because the experience proved that most people were willing to move past the situation and treat me normally. At the sorority event, I ended up in a conversation with a sophomore who mentioned she'd almost fallen into a similar pattern with a manipulative friend last year. She described how this girl would borrow her textbooks, then tell their study group she was lending them out, and how she'd started noticing other small lies about who owned what. The sophomore said she'd confronted her friend early before things escalated, and the friendship ended badly, but she was glad she'd trusted her instincts. Listening to her story made me realize that Bella's behavior wasn't some unique evil, but rather tapped into common social dynamics around wealth and status that lots of people experienced. The sophomore said insecurity makes people do wild things to feel like they belong, especially in college where everyone's trying to figure out their identity. Her perspective helped me see the situation as less personal and more about universal struggles with authenticity and social pressure. We exchanged numbers before I left, and she said I should text her if I ever wanted to grab coffee, and the simple offer of normal friendship felt good. The following week, the campus newspaper ran a feature article about authenticity and social media deception that didn't name Bella specifically, but everyone knew what inspired it. The article discussed how platforms like Instagram create pressure to present curated versions of ourselves, and how some people take that performance too far by actively lying about their circumstances. A reporter had reached out asking if I'd be willing to share my perspective, and I'd agreed to be quoted anonymously about the importance of being genuine, even when it feels uncomfortable. Seeing my words in print talking about how hiding who you are creates space for others to fill in false narratives felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. Several people texted me screenshots of the article saying it resonated with them, and the public acknowledgement that deception hurts everyone involved made me feel less alone in processing what happened. The article sparked conversations across campus about authenticity versus privacy and where the line should be, and I appreciated that the discussion moved beyond just gossip about Bella's specific situation. My parents called that weekend to tell me they'd decided to be more open about our Family Foundation's scholarship program at my university. My mother explained that they'd always kept their philanthropy quiet to avoid drawing attention, but hiding it actually prevented students who could benefit from knowing about available resources. She said the Bella situation made her realize that excessive privacy can be its own form of selfishness when it keeps help hidden from people who need it. My father added that they were planning to work with the Financial Aid Office to better publicize the scholarship criteria and application process. Listening to them talk about adjusting their approach to privacy made me see the parallel to my own excessive secrecy about my background. My mother said being genuine doesn't mean broadcasting every detail of your life, but it does mean being honest when it matters and not creating information vacuums that others can exploit. I told them I was proud of their decision to be more open about the foundation, and that I was learning similar lessons about balancing privacy with authenticity. 2 weeks later, I volunteered to help with my Family Foundation's scholarship selection committee, sitting in on interviews with applicants who were genuinely struggling financially. The first student I met was working overnight shifts at a grocery store while taking a full course load, and she talked about choosing between buying textbooks or paying for groceries some months. Another applicant described how she'd been homeless for part of high school after her parents lost their house, and how she was terrified of falling back into that situation if she couldn't afford to stay in the school. Listening to their authentic stories about real financial hardship gave me perspective on how offensive Bella's fake poverty narrative must have been to students facing actual economic challenges. These were people with legitimate struggles who would never dream of pretending to own things that weren't theirs or manipulating others for social status. The experience made me angry at Bella all over again, but in a different way that felt less about personal betrayal and more about the insult to people with genuine need. During one scholarship interview, I met a student whose story about working 2 jobs while maintaining a strong grade point average made my chest tighten with a mix of admiration and renewed anger. She described getting up at 4 in the morning to work a bakery shift before classes, then heading to her evening job at the library and somehow still finding time to study and participate in campus activities. She talked about it matter-of-factly without asking for sympathy, just explaining her reality as she applied for funding that could help her cut back to one job. Sitting across from her, I realized how insulting Bella's performance must have been to students like this, who were actually living the struggle Bella had been faking. My anger at Bella resurfaced, but felt more righteous and less personal, like I was mad on behalf of people whose real challenges got minimized by someone treating poverty as a costume. After the interview ended, I found myself hoping we could offer this student the full scholarship amount, because her authentic determination deserved support. Oliver and I grabbed lunch between classes a few days later at the campus food court. He mentioned he'd been thinking about what attracted him to Bella initially, trying to understand how he missed so many red flags. He said her apparent confidence and stories about overcoming challenges had seemed impressive at the time, like she was this resilient person who'd built herself up from difficult circumstances. Now he realized he was attracted to the narrative she'd constructed, rather than seeing who she actually was underneath the performance. Oliver said he was learning to look for authenticity in people, rather than being impressed by compelling stories, and that meant paying attention to consistency between what people say and what they do. I nodded because his reflection matched my own realizations about how I'd been so detached from the situation that I'd missed the harm being done. I shared with Oliver that I'd been thinking about how to balance privacy with honesty going forward, because I didn't want to swing too far in either direction. I said I wanted to avoid both extremes of hiding everything about my background and oversharing details that weren't relevant to everyday interactions. Oliver listened and then suggested that the goal should be being genuine about who you are without using your background as either a shield or a weapon. He said that meant being honest when it mattered, like when someone directly asked about your life, but not leading with your financial status, or using it to impress people or keep them at distance. His framing helped me see that authenticity wasn't about disclosure levels, but about intention and honesty in how you present yourself. We finished lunch talking about other topics, and I felt grateful to have a friend who understood the complicated dynamics of wealth and identity without judgment. 3 months after the cabin incident, I saw Bella on campus for the first time since she'd withdrawn from our shared classes. She was walking across the main quad with the campus counselor heading toward the student services building, and she looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her in the library. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she was wearing clean clothes that fit properly, and something about her posture seemed less desperate than before. Our eyes met for just a second as we passed each other on the sidewalk, and she gave a small tentative nod that I returned before we both kept walking in opposite directions. The brief exchange felt significant somehow, like a mutual acknowledgement that we'd both moved forward separately, without needing to have some dramatic conversation about forgiveness or closure. That evening, I texted Oliver about seeing Bella and feeling a strange sense of closure without actually speaking to her. He responded quickly saying that sometimes the best resolution is simply moving forward separately, that not every conflict needs a dramatic final confrontation or reconciliation to be truly over. His text continued saying that real closure comes from internal processing and growth, rather than needing the other person to apologize perfectly or validate your feelings. I appreciated his perspective because it gave me permission to let the situation rest, without feeling like I'd left something unfinished by not having a big emotional conversation with Bella. We texted back and forth for a few more minutes about other things, and I felt settled in a way I hadn't expected. Like seeing Bella looking healthier had somehow released me from carrying anger I didn't realize I was still holding. The week after my conversation with Oliver about seeing Bella on campus, my economics professor stopped me after class and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We walked to her office where she sat down and told me she'd been impressed with how my class participation had improved over the semester, and that my analytical skills during discussions showed real understanding of the material. She said the department was looking for teaching assistants for next semester, and wondered if I'd be interested in the position, because she thought I could really help other students grasp difficult concepts. I felt surprised because I'd never seen myself as someone who should be teaching others, but something about the offer felt right. Like it was a chance to step into a more visible role without either hiding who I was or making a big deal about my background. I accepted, and she smiled, saying she'd send me the paperwork, and we'd meet before next semester to discuss which sections I'd be helping with. Walking out of her office, I felt this quiet sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with being recognized for actual effort and ability. Alexandra texted me that same evening asking if I wanted to go hiking that weekend at a trail she'd discovered about an hour from campus. I said yes, and we spent Saturday morning climbing through woods that smelled like pine and dirt, talking about everything from our economics class to her plans after graduation to my new teaching assistant position. She mentioned she was thinking about graduate school but wasn't sure if she wanted to dive straight into more academics or take a year to work first, and I shared that I'd been considering similar questions about my own future. At the top of the trail, we sat on a flat rock eating the sandwiches we'd packed, and she said she was really glad we'd become actual friends, instead of just being connected through the whole Bella situation. I agreed and realized our friendship felt easy and normal in a way that had nothing to do with complicated history or social dynamics. On the drive back, she asked if I wanted to join her family at their lake house over summer break for a long weekend, saying it would be low-key with just swimming and reading and maybe some kayaking. I accepted without hesitation because the invitation felt genuine and uncomplicated, like she wanted me there because she enjoyed my company and not because of any other reason. Spring semester wound down with final exams and last-minute study sessions, and Portia organized a small dinner party at her apartment for our study group on the last Friday before everyone left for summer. She texted me asking if I could bring dessert and help her set up before people arrived, including me naturally in the planning like I was a regular part of the group, rather than someone on the outside. I showed up early with a store-bought pie because I can't bake, and helped her arrange chairs around her tiny dining table, while we talked about summer plans and which classes we were taking next semester. Michaela arrived next, then the two other students from our group, and we spent 3 hours eating pasta and arguing about economic theory and sharing stories about our worst professors. Nobody treated me differently or made awkward references to my family's money or the Bella drama, and the whole evening felt like evidence that I'd successfully integrated into a social circle as my actual self, rather than either hiding my background or leading with it. When I left that night, I felt settled in a way I hadn't experienced before, like I'd finally figured out how to exist in the world without either extreme of total detachment or constant performance. The next morning, I started packing up my dorm room for summer break, folding clothes into boxes and taking down the few photos I'd hung on my walls. As I wrapped my desk lamp in newspaper, I found myself thinking about how the entire Bella situation had forced me to examine my own relationship with wealth and pride and authenticity, in ways I'd been avoiding for years. I'd spent so long being detached and above it all, telling myself I didn't care what people thought while actually using that detachment as armor against having to be vulnerable or real with anyone. The whole mess had been uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but it taught me that being genuine, even when it's complicated, matters more than staying safely removed from everything. I was heading into summer with clearer boundaries about what I would and wouldn't tolerate, genuine friendships with people who knew the real me, and a healthier balance between keeping my private life private and being honest about who I actually was. I taped up the last box and looked around my empty room, feeling ready for whatever came next. Because I finally understood that authenticity wasn't about how much you shared or hid, but about being honest in your interactions and not using your background as either a weapon or a shield.